When I look back, everything seemed too perfect to break. My family, a happy family with my brother, Jason, and I always together throughout life. My parents, though not wealthy, always made us feel like we had enough. The evenings spent together, the conversations full of laughter, we built a warm home where we all felt safe and loved. Jason was the kind of older brother you could rely on. He was my protector when we were younger, always making me feel safe in his embrace. I thought he was the one person I could always depend on, no matter what. But one day, everything changed. All of it came crashing down because of one unexpected document I found in my parents' drawer. The sense of peace in our family suddenly vanished. Secrets that had never been revealed, things I never thought existed, came out into the open. I vividly remember the day I found the will, a will I never knew existed. What I discovered wasn't just about assets, it was about decisions that had been made without me knowing. The first feeling I had was one of disbelief. How could this happen? I wondered, confused, unable to understand why my family would do this to me. When I looked at the will, Jason's name was written there, with a portion of the inheritance I thought would be mine. And this truth hit me like a ton of bricks. It wasn't just about money or material things, it was about the trust I had in my brother. Jason, the person I had called my brother, was now the one who had taken it all away from me. I couldn't understand why he would do this. How could he betray me like this when I had trusted him with everything? When I decided to confront Jason, I had no idea what I would be facing. But one thing was certain, my life would never be the same again. No more that sense of safety. No more trust in family. I had to do something about this, I had to figure out why this had happened, and more importantly, I had to figure out how to take back what was rightfully mine. It wasn't until I sat down that I realized the enormity of what I was dealing with. The will in front of me wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a declaration of betrayal. The words on the page felt surreal, like something from a twisted story. I had always trusted my parents to be fair, to love both Jason and me equally, but now I was questioning everything. The will clearly stated that Jason was to inherit the majority of our family's assets. Everything. The house, the savings, the investments, even the antique collection that my grandfather had left us. The entire family history, the legacy my parents had worked so hard to build, was being handed over to him. I felt a mix of anger, confusion, and a deep sense of loss. The thing that hit me hardest was not just the financial loss, but the betrayal of the one person I thought I could count on. The more I read the will, the more I became convinced that Jason had been planning this for a while. How could he have kept this secret from me? How could he have lived with himself, knowing what he was doing to me, to our family? It felt like my entire life had been a lie. I couldn't understand how Jason, the same person who had always been my protector, could now be the one to destroy me. Was this all about greed? Or was there something deeper, something I didn't know? I had to find out. I immediately confronted Jason. I couldn't hold it in anymore, I needed answers. We had always been close, but now, standing face to face with him, I didn't know who he was anymore. I asked him, Jason, why? Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you even give me a chance? His eyes were cold, his demeanor distant, almost as if he had prepared himself for this moment long before I had. At first, he denied everything. He claimed that it was always the plan for him to inherit everything. He told me that our parents had trusted him with the responsibility. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of guilt, that told me his words weren't entirely truthful. He wasn't being honest with me. The more we spoke, the clearer it became. Jason had manipulated our parents into believing he was the most responsible one. He had even gone as far as to play the role of the perfect son, the perfect brother. Meanwhile, he had been systematically setting up his claim to the inheritance, ensuring that there was nothing left for me. It was all a game to him, a game he had been playing for years, and I was the pawn. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw everything at him, all the years of trust, all the love I had given him, but I knew it wouldn't change anything. The damage was done. The revelation was too much to process in that moment. I was left standing there, feeling empty, abandoned by the one person I had always trusted. As I left his house that day, I knew things could never go back to the way they were. The weight of the betrayal hung heavily on my chest. But something else stirred within me, a determination, a fire. I would not let him get away with this. I wouldn't let him destroy me. If he thought he had won, he was mistaken. I would take back what was mine. And I would make sure he paid for what he had done. The days following our confrontation were the darkest I'd ever known. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. my mind constantly replaying every moment of the conversation with Jason. The more I thought about it, the more my anger grew, boiling over until it consumed every part of me. How could he betray me like that? How could he, my brother, the person I trusted most in this world, steal what was rightfully mine? It wasn't just about money. It wasn't just about the inheritance. It was the trust he shattered, the bond we shared that was now nothing but a hollow memory. I had always believed that family was everything. I thought Jason and I would grow old together, sharing the same memories, the same love. But now I couldn't even look at him without feeling a deep, gnawing sense of betrayal. I spent hours going through the will again and again, hoping that maybe I'd missed something, hoping there was a mistake, some sort of loophole that would make it all right again. But there was nothing. The will was clear. Jason had everything, and I had nothing. I tried reaching out to my parents, but they were oddly distant, almost as if they already knew how this would play out. Their silence was deafening. They didn't even seem surprised when I confronted them. Instead of offering sympathy, they justified their actions, telling me that Jason was the one who could handle the responsibility. They told me they'd always known he was the right choice. But how could they say that? How could they give up everything without even considering me? It felt like a betrayal not just from Jason, but from my parents too. I was nothing more than a footnote in their plans, a person to be brushed aside without a second thought. I remember feeling numb, like I was watching my own life unfold from a distance. My entire world had been upended in the span of a few days. I had been replaced, forgotten, and I had no idea how to get it all back. But there was one thing I knew for sure. I wasn't going to sit back and let Jason get away with this. I needed a plan. I needed to think. I couldn't let my emotions cloud my judgment. Revenge wasn't about just acting out of anger. It had to be calculated. It had to be perfect. I started looking for weaknesses. Jason wasn't invincible. He had his flaws. He was too confident, too sure of himself. He thought that no one would question him, that no one would dare go against him. But he was wrong. I started to gather information. I found old documents, receipts, emails, anything that would expose him for what he truly was. It was going to take time, but I knew I had to be patient. Jason had spent years building his empire, and I was going to tear it all down piece by piece. But I had to do it the right way. The first step was simple, expose him, but I had to make it hurt. I couldn't just confront him again. I couldn't give him a chance to lie his way out of this one. No, I had to make him feel the weight of what he'd done. I knew the perfect place to start, the business he had been running under my parents' name. It was a small company, but it had value. Jason had used it as his personal piggy bank, funneling money through it, hiding transactions, all to keep up the illusion of being the perfect son, the perfect businessman. It was all a lie, and I was going to expose it. I spent days researching, piecing together evidence, learning the ins and outs of the business. I knew exactly what I needed to do. The first move was simple but effective. I made an anonymous tip to the IRS. Jason would have no idea what hit him. But as I sat there, looking at the papers spread out before me, something inside me shifted. It wasn't just about the business or the money anymore. It wasn't about the inheritance. It was about making him feel everything I had felt. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the pain. This wasn't just about justice, it was about something deeper. I wanted to break him the same way he had broken me. I wanted him to know that no matter how much he had, no matter how successful he became, it would never fill the hole he had created in my heart. And that was when I realized this wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, and my future. I wasn't going to let him take that from me. The tip had been made. The IRS would come for Jason's business, and soon, everything he'd built would begin to unravel. But as I waited for the consequences to unfold, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The world around me felt heavier, more suffocating with every passing day. The anticipation of what was coming felt almost unbearable. Jason had no idea what was coming for him. As the days went by, I watched him with a calm demeanor, thinking I had it all under control. But deep down, I could feel the weight of the storm brewing, and I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down on him. And then, just like that, it happened. It was a normal afternoon when I first heard the news. I had been pacing in my living room, running through my plan one last time, when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but I picked up anyway. "Ms. Carter?" The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, but I could tell by the tone that it wasn't just a random call. "Yes," I answered, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is Agent Daniels with the IRS. We need to speak with you about some irregularities in your brother's business dealings, the voice said, and I could hear the official weight in the words. My heart skipped a beat. The shock hit me like a tidal wave, but I didn't let it show. I had anticipated this, but hearing it out loud, hearing them speak about Jason like this, made everything feel so much more real. I tried to steady my breath, but I couldn't stop the rush of adrenaline flooding my veins. What do you need from me? I asked, keeping my voice even, trying not to let the tremor I felt show. We have some paperwork that indicates your brother has been funneling money through his company, Agent Daniels explained. There have been reports filed about potential tax evasion, and we need your help in confirming some details. I swallowed hard. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for. But somehow, the reality of it felt hollow. As much as I wanted to feel triumphant, I felt nothing but an overwhelming sense of emptiness. The truth was, I didn't know if destroying Jason would make me feel better. I'll cooperate, I said, not knowing what else to say. The call ended shortly after that, and I was left alone in my thoughts. The plan was working, but it didn't bring the satisfaction I thought it would. It didn't heal the wounds that had been left in the wake of his betrayal. All I felt now was the weight of what was about to happen, the storm that was just beginning to form, and the consequences that would follow. Jason had no idea what was coming. I hadn't told him about the tip to the IRS yet. He was still living his life, oblivious to the fact that everything he'd worked for was about to fall apart. For the next few days, I watched as the investigation progressed, each step making his life harder. The IRS began to subpoena records from the business, and Jason's once thriving empire began to crumble under the weight of the scrutiny. I couldn't help but notice the changes in him. The once confident man who walked into every room like he owned it was now frazzled and nervous, his eyes constantly darting around as if expecting someone to expose him at any moment. It was almost like watching a man slowly suffocate under his own lies. And then came the moment that really shook him, when he received the first letter from the IRS demanding a formal audit. I remember the look on his face when he read it. His hands shook, his lips parted as if he couldn't comprehend what he was seeing. But he was too proud to admit defeat. Instead, he acted out, lashing out at anyone who dared ask about the audit. He blamed the IRS, the government, and even me for the mess he was in, but deep down, he knew that none of that mattered. The truth was out, and there was no way to bury it. I watched all of this unfold from a distance, feeling both satisfaction and sadness. Was this truly what I wanted, to see him suffer? Was it enough to destroy him, or did I need to do more? The answer came to me slowly, a realization that I couldn't ignore. Destroying Jason would never be enough for me to feel whole again. I could take his business, his wealth, and his reputation, but I would never be able to erase the emptiness that lingered in my heart. The betrayal was too deep, too painful for mere revenge to fill. But that didn't mean I was done. No, Jason still had a long way to go before he truly understood the depth of what he had done. The game was far from over, and now, it was time for the next phase. I wasn't just going to take away his wealth. I was going to take away everything that defined him. His pride, his confidence, his sense of security. I would make him feel the same hopelessness that had consumed me ever since I discovered the truth. After the shock of the IRS investigation, everything in my life seemed to have fallen into place, but in an unsettling way. Jason was unraveling, and I could see it in his every move. He was no longer the cocky, self-assured brother I once knew. He was floundering, looking for a way out, but there was no escape. The trap had been set, and now it was just a matter of letting him sweat it out until he realized that there was no way to undo what he'd done. The irony wasn't lost on me. Jason had always considered himself the golden child, the one everyone in the family relied on, the one who could do no wrong. But now he was cornered, and the very thing that had made him feel untouchable, the family's wealth and legacy, was slipping away from him. I wanted to savor the moment, to feel some sense of triumph, but the truth was, I didn't feel the satisfaction I had anticipated. The revenge, the justice, it didn't taste as sweet as I thought it would. The IRS investigation was only the beginning. Now that the initial blow had been delivered, I needed to find a way to make sure Jason didn't just recover and go on with his life. I had to keep pushing, keep driving him toward the edge. I had to ensure that the damage was irreversible, that he would never forget the devastation he had caused. I knew that I couldn't let him off the hook just because he was facing legal trouble. There was more at stake here. My dignity, my future, everything I had lost because of his greed and manipulation needed to be restored. So I began my plan for the next phase of my revenge. The first step was to take away his confidence, to destroy the facade of the perfect businessman that he had carefully crafted for so long. Jason had always used the family company as his armor, his shield against the world. But I knew that his success was built on lies, manipulation, and deceit. If I could expose the extent of his wrongdoings, his reputation would be shattered beyond repair. I started by reaching out to some of the company's old clients, those who had worked with Jason in the past and who knew about his shady business practices. It wasn't hard to find people who were willing to talk, people who had been wronged by Jason's deceitful ways. One by one, I gathered their testimonies, evidence of the lies, the fraud, the stolen money. With each phone call, I felt the sense of justice that I had longed for creeping back into my heart. This wasn't just about taking Jason's money anymore. It was about exposing him for who he really was. But I wasn't done yet. The next part of my plan involved getting into the legal records, getting access to the contracts, the business deals, and the shady financial transactions that Jason had tried to cover up. It took some effort, but I was determined. I had to make sure that Jason's empire didn't just crumble, but completely collapsed under the weight of his own lies. The documents I uncovered were damning. They revealed Jason's long history of manipulation, his use of the family business as his own personal cash cow. I could see the carefully calculated moves he'd made over the years, how he had exploited everyone around him, including me. It was all there, written in black and white. And now I had the power to expose it all. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't just sit back and watch him squirm. No, I needed to take action. I contacted a journalist I had worked with in the past, someone who had a reputation for uncovering the most scandalous stories in the business world. I sent them the evidence, the documents, everything that proved Jason's guilt. It didn't take long before the story was picked up by the media, and suddenly, Jason's name was everywhere, linked to corruption, fraud, and the destruction of everything the family had worked for. The media storm was exactly what I needed. It was the public humiliation he had to face, the price for what he had done to me, to our family, and to the life I once thought we had. The business partners he'd been so proud of began to pull out of deals. The once loyal employees started quitting, disgusted by the truth that had finally come to light. And worst of all, the people who had once seen him as a respected businessman were now turning their backs on him. It was painful to watch, but it felt necessary. I couldn't let him get away with this. I couldn't let him rebuild to come out of this unscathed. Jason had thought that he was untouchable, but I was about to prove him wrong. However, as I watched everything crumble around him, I couldn't deny the gnawing sense of emptiness that filled me. The revenge that I had meticulously planned and carried out was having the effect I wanted, but it wasn't giving me the peace I had hoped for. Seeing Jason break down, watching him lose everything should have been enough. But it wasn't. I still felt hollow, still felt the loss. This battle wasn't over, and I wasn't finished with him yet, but the reality of revenge was beginning to hit me harder than I had expected. It wasn't enough to just destroy him. There was something deeper, something more personal that I needed to reclaim. And that was when it hit me. Revenge wasn't just about him. It was about me, about my own healing. I had to let go of the bitterness that had consumed me for so long. The moment of realization was both liberating and terrifying. I had spent so much of my energy focused on destroying Jason that I hadn't taken the time to realize that I was hurting too. My life had been consumed with the need for revenge, and yet it wasn't bringing me the peace I thought it would. I was still empty, still angry, but I wasn't ready to give up, not yet. I needed to finish what I started, to make sure Jason paid for everything he'd taken from me. I had already exposed him publicly, but I knew that wasn't enough. I needed something more. A final, irreversible blow that would leave him not just humiliated, but truly broken. The next step of my plan was simple, but it would be devastating. I had to get inside Jason's head. He thought he was untouchable. He thought that no one could bring him down. He was wrong. I had learned enough about him over the years to know that he had a weakness, his ego. His pride was his greatest strength, but also his greatest flaw. So I set out to make him doubt everything he had ever known. I had already taken everything from him that he cared about, the business, the reputation, the trust of the family. Now I would make him question the very foundation of his life. I started by manipulating the people around him. I reached out to his closest allies, the ones who had supported him through thick and thin, and planted seeds of doubt. I whispered about how Jason had betrayed not just me, but them as well. I painted a picture of a man who had used and discarded everyone in his life for his own gain. Slowly, I watched as his support system began to fracture. One by one, his allies turned their backs on him. The people who had once stood by his side now questioned his loyalty, his integrity. It wasn't long before Jason began to notice the cracks forming around him. The whispers grew louder, and soon he found himself alone, just as I had been. But I didn't stop there. I knew Jason better than anyone, and I knew how to push him to the edge. So, I set up a meeting with him, an opportunity for him to try and regain some control over the situation. I knew he would come to me, desperate to fix the damage I had done. But I wasn't there to listen to his excuses or apologies. I was there to break him. When he walked into the room, I could see it in his eyes. He was on the brink of losing everything, but his arrogance still lingered. He tried to act like he was still in control, tried to play the same game he'd always played, but I could tell he was starting to crack. I let him talk, let him plead his case, but inside, I was already several steps ahead. I had a plan, and it was coming to fruition. The final piece of the puzzle was about to fall into place. After he had finished speaking, I finally spoke, my voice calm and steady. "You're a fool, Jason. You really thought you could get away with everything you've done? You thought you could destroy me and get away with it. Look at you now. Alone, broken. Your empire is crumbling, and you have no one to blame but yourself." His face turned pale, the arrogance fading from his eyes as he realized just how deep he had fallen. But that wasn't enough for me. No, I needed to see him truly suffer, to feel the weight of the betrayal he had inflicted on me. "I didn't just destroy your business, Jason," I continued, my voice growing colder. "I destroyed everything you ever believed in. Your reputation, your pride, and now you're going to lose everything you've worked for." He looked at me, his face a mix of disbelief and fury, but I could see the fear in his eyes. It was the same fear I had felt all those years ago when I realized he had taken everything from me. And then, I delivered the final blow. "I've made sure your dirty secrets are out there for everyone to see," I said, pulling out the documents that would expose him once and for all. "Your lies, your manipulation, it's all coming to light, Jason. You're finished." He looked at the papers, his eyes wide with horror, and I knew I had won. He couldn't escape this. The truth was out, and there was no way for him to fix it. His world was falling apart, and I couldn't help but feel a twisted sense of satisfaction as I watched him crumble under the weight of his own actions. But even as Jason's world disintegrated in front of me, I realized something. Revenge, no matter how perfectly executed, wasn't going to heal the wounds he had caused. It wasn't going to bring back the trust I had lost or the life I once knew. In that moment, as I watched him suffer, I finally understood. Revenge had given me nothing but emptiness. The fight wasn't over, but I knew that deep down, it was never going to bring me the peace I so desperately wanted. Jason's downfall was complete. He was broken just as I had been. But the price had been steep, and I couldn't ignore the toll it had taken on me. I had won, but at what cost? As the dust began to settle and Jason's world crumbled around him, I thought I would finally feel the sense of closure I had been seeking for so long. But instead, there was something else, something I hadn't expected. It was a discovery that shook me to my core. I had spent the last few weeks watching Jason's life spiral out of control, and in a way, I felt some satisfaction in seeing him suffer. But the more I watched, the more I realized that my revenge wasn't as complete as I thought. There was something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface that I hadn't uncovered yet. And this discovery would change everything. It all started with a phone call I received one evening. I had been sitting in my apartment, going over the latest headlines about Jason's fall from grace, when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something about it intrigued me, so I picked up. "Ms. Carter?" The voice on the other end was calm, professional. "This is Detective Lawson with the police. I'm afraid we have some information regarding your brother's case that you may want to hear." I felt a chill run down my spine. My mind immediately went to the worst-case scenario. Had Jason somehow managed to escape the consequences of his actions? Had he orchestrated some final twist to save himself? "I'm listening," I said, my voice tight with anticipation. "We've been investigating some of the accounts tied to your brother's business, and we found something that doesn't quite add up," Detective Lawson explained. "It seems that your brother wasn't the only one involved in the fraudulent activities. There are connections to a much bigger network, and it involves several people you may know." I sat up straight, my heart racing. My mind was already racing through the possibilities. Could there be more people involved in this? Was Jason just a pawn in a larger scheme? Who else is involved? I demanded, my voice barely above a whisper. We can't disclose all the details just yet, but we believe there's a group of individuals who helped Jason cover up his tracks, the detective continued. We also have reason to believe that your parents may have been more aware of what was going on than they let on. The words hit me like a thunderclap. My parents, how could they have been involved in this? Had they known all along what Jason had been doing? I thought back to the conversations I'd had with them, the way they had stood by Jason even as everything began to unravel. Could they have known about his manipulation and turned a blind eye? My mind reeled with the implications of what I was hearing. Everything I thought I knew about my family, about my life, was being questioned. Jason had been the one to betray me, but what if he wasn't the only one? What if I had been living a lie all along? I hung up the phone and sat there, stunned by the weight of the revelation. My hands shook as I tried to process everything. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind, but now I was faced with an even bigger question. What if my entire family had been complicit in Jason's betrayal? What if they had known about his schemes, his lies, and his manipulation, and did nothing? The more I thought about it, the more the pieces began to fall into place. The way my parents had treated me during the aftermath of the will, their indifference to my feelings, the way they had always made excuses for Jason's behavior. It was all starting to make sense. They hadn't just been passive, they had actively covered for him, protected him, while I was left in the dark. This new discovery changed everything. I had thought I was fighting for justice, fighting for what was rightfully mine. But now, I realized that the betrayal ran much deeper than just Jason. It was my entire family that had betrayed me. And that revelation hit harder than anything Jason had done. I knew I had to confront them. I couldn't just let this go. I had spent so much time focusing on Jason, but now it was time to turn the spotlight on my parents, to expose them for the role they had played in this betrayal. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to rest until I got them. But as I stood up, determined to get the truth, a new feeling settled over me. It wasn't just anger or betrayal, it was something darker. I realized that this fight wasn't just about money, or revenge, or even justice anymore. It was about reclaiming the pieces of myself that had been shattered. It was about taking back control of my life, my future, and my family. And that meant one thing: I wasn't done yet. The revelation about my parents had shaken me more than I cared to admit. All along, I had assumed that my battle was only with Jason. But now, I realized the real enemy had always been much closer to me. My parents, the people I trusted the most, had been complicit in Jason's manipulation, choosing to protect him while I was left to pick up the pieces of my broken life. It felt like a betrayal of the highest order. They were supposed to be the ones who had my back, the ones who would never allow anyone to hurt me. But instead, they had stood by and watched as Jason destroyed everything I had worked for, all while quietly supporting his actions behind closed doors. And now, I knew that if I wanted to truly reclaim my life, I couldn't just target Jason. I had to make them see the depth of their mistake, to make them understand the pain they had caused me. I spent the next few days planning my next move carefully. I had already destroyed Jason's business, shattered his reputation, and exposed him for the liar and manipulator he was. But I knew that revenge, true revenge, wasn't just about destroying someone's life. It was about breaking them psychologically, making them doubt themselves, making them suffer in a way that no amount of material loss could ever undo. It was time to get into their heads, my parents' and Jason's, and make them feel the crushing weight of the damage they had caused. I knew my parents would never see their actions as wrong, at least not at first. They had always defended Jason, even when I was left in the dust. They would always justify their choices, tell me that it was what was best for the family, that Jason was the one who could handle everything. But I had a plan that would force them to face the truth. It would be impossible for them to ignore the consequences of their actions once I was through with them. My first step was simple: isolate them. I couldn't confront them head-on just yet, but I could slowly chip away at the illusion they had built around themselves. So, I began to plant seeds of doubt in their minds. About each other, about Jason's motivations, about their own role in everything that had happened. I reached out to some of my parents' close friends, people who had been around when Jason was building his empire. I planted subtle hints about Jason's true character, about how he had been lying to everyone, including my parents. I didn't need to make them believe everything I said, just enough for them to question their blind loyalty to him. Then, I began to turn the tables on Jason. I fed him information that would make him paranoid. I knew Jason's ego well enough to understand that he couldn't stand being undermined, especially not by someone like me. I used his arrogance against him, making him believe that everyone was turning on him. I watched as he grew more agitated, more desperate to fix the damage that was already beyond repair. He had no idea that the walls around him were closing in, and I was the one tightening the noose. But the most satisfying part of my plan came when I finally decided to confront my parents. I had to make them feel the same fear, the same doubt that had plagued me for so long. I invited them over to my apartment under the guise of a calm family gathering. But what they didn't know was that this would be the moment when they would be forced to face everything they had ignored. As soon as they sat down, I began. I didn't hold back. I showed them the documents I had gathered, the testimonies from people who had been wronged by Jason's manipulation, and the evidence of the lies they had helped cover up. It wasn't just about Jason anymore. It was about their role in enabling him, their complicity in everything that had happened. I watched their faces change as the weight of their own mistakes began to sink in. My mother's face was pale, her eyes filled with shock and disbelief. My father, always the stoic one, couldn't even look at me. They tried to defend themselves, tried to explain their actions, but I could see it in their eyes. They knew they had failed me. They had betrayed me just like Jason had, and they couldn't hide from it anymore. The silence that followed was suffocating. I could feel their guilt hanging in the air, thick and heavy. They didn't know how to apologize, didn't know how to make things right. But for me, that was enough. They needed to see the consequences of their blind loyalty to Jason. They needed to feel the pain I had been carrying for so long. It wasn't enough to destroy Jason's life. It wasn't enough to take away everything he had built. What I truly wanted was to make them feel the weight of the choices they had made, to force them to confront the hurt they had caused me. And in that moment, as I watched them struggle with their guilt, I realized that my revenge had been more than just a battle for justice. It had been a battle for my own healing. But even as I stood there, watching them crumble under the weight of their actions, a part of me knew that it would never be enough. No amount of revenge could undo the past. No amount of suffering could fill the emptiness that had been left behind. The damage was done, and I could never go back to the way things were. It wasn't enough, I realized, to simply confront my parents and show them the damage they had done. As much as I wanted to make them feel the full weight of their betrayal, I couldn't deny the gnawing feeling in my gut that told me the game wasn't finished yet. The revenge wasn't complete, not as long as Jason still thought he could escape the consequences of his actions. He hadn't yet paid for the psychological toll he had inflicted on me, for the way he had twisted everything I thought I knew about family. But now, I had him exactly where I wanted him. And I would not let him out of my grasp until he felt the full force of his betrayal. I continued to feed Jason misinformation. I fed him half-truths and twisted realities, all carefully calculated to manipulate his already fragile mental state. The more I made him doubt, the more his paranoia grew. He started seeing shadows in every corner, fearing that everyone around him was conspiring against him. His once composed facade began to crumble, piece by piece, until he was unrecognizable. I'd watched this transformation unfold before my eyes. Jason, who had always been so confident, so in control, was now a shell of the man he once was. His every move was dictated by fear. Fear of losing more, fear of being exposed, fear of facing the truth he had long buried. And the most beautiful part? He didn't even know who to trust anymore, not even himself. I saw the cracks beginning to form in his relationships. Friends he had relied on for years started pulling away, noticing his increasing instability. He could no longer keep up the act of the golden son or the successful businessman. The walls were closing in on him, and for the first time, he realized that no amount of manipulation could save him. The final nail in the coffin was when I made him believe that our parents had been involved in everything. I carefully planted the seed of doubt in his mind, making him question their loyalty, their support of him. Jason was no longer sure if anyone was on his side, and I watched as he began to implode. He'd always believed that our parents would back him, that they'd always be there for him, but now, that foundation was crumbling beneath his feet. He came to me one night, his face pale, his eyes wild with confusion. The arrogance that had once radiated from him was gone, replaced with desperation. He wanted to know the truth. He wanted to know if I had been the one to set him up, to destroy everything he had worked for. But it wasn't just about what I had done to him. It was about what he had done to me, to my life, and to our family. He had betrayed me, and I wasn't going to let him get away with it. I stared at him, knowing that this was the moment when I had him exactly where I wanted him. He had no more control, no more power. Everything he had built, everything he had manipulated was slipping away, and I was the one pulling the strings. You really thought you could destroy me and get away with it? I said, my voice calm, but carrying the weight of everything I had been holding in for so long. You thought you could take everything from me and still walk away scot-free. Well, Jason, the truth is, you're just as broken as I am. I saw the flicker of realization in his eyes. He was starting to understand, starting to grasp the magnitude of what had been done. But it was too late for him to fix it. The trap had been set, and there was no way out. He tried to plead, tried to convince me that everything had been a mistake, that he never meant to hurt me, but I wasn't buying it. This wasn't about forgiveness. This wasn't about healing. It was about justice. It was about making him feel what I had felt for so long. And now, I had the power. I had him where I wanted him, and I wasn't going to let him go until he understood the cost of what he had done. The truth hit him like a ton of bricks. His guilt was palpable, and for the first time, he didn't know how to escape it. He had always thought he could control the situation, manipulate everyone around him, but now, he was the one trapped. And as I watched him squirm, I realized that the battle had shifted. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about taking back control of my life, reclaiming the pieces of myself that Jason had stolen. But even as I watched his world fall apart, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. It was satisfying to watch him suffer, to see him finally face the consequences of his actions, but it still didn't fill the emptiness inside me. No amount of revenge could heal the wounds he had caused. No amount of suffering could make me whole again. As I walked away from Jason that night, I realized that I had done everything I could to destroy him, to make him feel the pain he had caused me. But the truth was, no amount of revenge would ever bring me the peace I longed for. And as much as I had tried to make him pay, I knew that the true cost of his betrayal was something neither of us could ever fully repay. It had all led to this moment. The storm that I had carefully cultivated, the years of manipulation, the calculated steps I had taken to expose the true nature of Jason's betrayal, all of it had brought us here. The moment when everything, every lie, every action would come to a head. Jason and I stood face to face once more, the weight of everything between us too heavy to ignore. His once confident gaze was gone, replaced by a desperation that I hadn't seen before. The arrogance that had defined him for so long had evaporated, and in its place there was only fear. Fear that the truth, everything I had exposed about him, had finally caught up to him. I didn't mean to hurt you, Jason said, his voice shaking. I was just trying to protect what I thought was mine. I thought this was the only way. I could see the tears welling up in his eyes, but they didn't affect me anymore. The time for pity was long gone. The man standing before me was no longer the brother I had once loved, the man I had trusted with my life. He was a stranger, someone who had burned every bridge, torn apart every connection that had once bound us together. You thought you could protect something that wasn't yours, I replied coldly. You never cared about me, Jason. You only cared about yourself, and you thought you could take everything from me and not face the consequences. His face flushed, and I could see the flicker of guilt in his eyes. But the truth was, the guilt was too little, too late. Jason had been given every chance to change, to make things right, but he had chosen greed, manipulation, and lies over family. And now, it was time for him to face what he had done. You were always so sure of yourself, weren't you? I continued, taking a step closer to him. You thought you were invincible. You thought that you could control everything, our family, our legacy, and me. But you were wrong. And now you have nothing left. Jason's shoulders sagged, and for a brief moment, he looked like the broken man he had become. The walls he had built around himself, the facade of success and power, had all crumbled away. The empire he had so carefully constructed had fallen to pieces, and in its place was just a man who had lost everything he once held dear. I paused for a moment, letting the weight of my words sink in. I wanted him to feel it, to understand the full extent of what he had done to me, to our family. But deep down, I knew that no amount of words would ever be enough. The damage had been done. Revenge had come, but the cost was steep, and even now, as I stood there watching Jason break, I couldn't help but wonder if it had been worth it. Everything's gone, Jason. The business, the trust of the family, the life you built, all of it's destroyed, I said, my voice quieter now. You could have had it all. You could have been my brother again, but you chose to betray me. You chose this. Jason's eyes searched mine, and I saw the flicker of regret in his gaze, but I didn't care about his regret. I didn't care about his apologies. What I had wanted, what I had fought for, was justice. And now, justice had been served. You're done, Jason, I said, my voice final. You've lost everything, and it's your own fault. There was nothing more to say. We stood there in silence, the weight of everything hanging between us. And as I turned to leave, I realized that I didn't feel the satisfaction I had expected. I had done it all. I had exposed him. I had broken him, but somehow it felt hollow. The emptiness that had driven me to this point was still there, gnawing at me. The truth was, revenge hadn't healed me. It hadn't given me the closure I had craved. It had only opened up more wounds, left me with more questions than answers. What now? What was I supposed to do with all of this pain, all of this anger, now that Jason had fallen? The door slammed behind me as I left him standing there, a broken man. I had won, but I still felt the weight of the years I had lost, the years that Jason had stolen from me. And though the battle was over, I knew that I would never be the same again. The silence that followed was deafening, and as I walked away from Jason, I couldn't shake the weight of the victory I had just claimed. My heart, once filled with rage and betrayal, now sat heavy in my chest, not with relief, but with the undeniable realization that the path I had chosen had left me broken in ways I hadn't anticipated. Revenge, I now understood, was not a cure. It wasn't a balm that could heal wounds. It was an open wound itself, bleeding deeper the longer you clung to it. For a moment, I stood outside the house, staring at the door I had just closed behind me. The world around me felt unreal, as if I were floating above it all, disconnected from the life I had once known. Jason was finished. The plan had worked perfectly, but now I was left with the aftermath. I had done what I set out to do, but the emptiness inside me had only grown. I thought back to the years I had spent with Jason, to the family I had once believed was untouchable. The laughter, the memories, the feeling of security, all of it now felt like a distant dream. I had spent so much time plotting his downfall, obsessing over how to make him feel the same pain he had caused me, that I had failed to see the damage I was doing to myself. The more I hurt him, the more I hurt myself. I could feel the weight of the regret pressing on me as I stood there. I had watched Jason break down, I had seen the life he had built crumble, and I had taken everything from him. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a hollow victory, a victory that had come at the cost of my own soul. I had wanted to watch him suffer, but now that it was over, all I felt was exhaustion. I had no idea where to go from here. For the next few days, I retreated from the world, letting the silence wash over me. I didn't speak to anyone, not my parents, not my friends, not even the few people who had been there for me throughout this journey. I couldn't bring myself to face them. Not yet. I needed time to figure out what had just happened to me, to understand what I had truly lost in all of this. The truth was, I wasn't sure if I could ever heal from the years of betrayal, from the love that had turned to ashes. I had spent so much time seeking justice that I had lost sight of the most important thing, my own healing. Revenge had consumed me, had driven me to a point where I was willing to destroy everything in order to get back at Jason. But in the process, I had destroyed a part of myself. I knew that I couldn't undo what had been done. The damage was permanent. Jason was gone, my family was shattered, and the path I had chosen was one I could never turn back from. But the question lingered in my mind, what now? What was left for me now that the revenge had been exacted? It wasn't until I sat in front of a mirror, staring at my reflection, that I realized the one thing that had always been missing: peace. No matter what I had taken from Jason, no matter how much I had destroyed, I would never find peace through vengeance. I would never find the closure I sought in the ruins of his life. I had to stop. I had to let go. But letting go wasn't easy. The pain I had carried for so long wasn't something that could just disappear. It wasn't something I could simply forget, but I had to try. I had to reclaim my life, my happiness, and my future. Revenge had taken everything from me, and now it was time to take it back. I didn't need to destroy Jason to move forward. I didn't need to see him suffer to heal. What I needed was to forgive, not him, but myself. I had allowed myself to be consumed by rage, by the need to see him hurt. And that had been my true mistake. It wasn't about what Jason had done to me. It was about what I had allowed myself to become. So I took a deep breath, and for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't in so long: a sense of freedom. The weight on my chest began to lift as I realized that I didn't have to carry this burden anymore. Jason's fate was sealed, but mine was still in my hands. It wasn't the ending I had expected. It wasn't the closure I had sought, but it was an ending nonetheless, an ending that marked the beginning of something new. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. I was done with revenge. I was done with the past. It was time to move forward. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and reflection. I had spent so long chasing after something I thought would give me peace, but now that the dust had settled, I felt nothing but exhaustion. The events of the past weeks had unfolded like a dark storm, each moment of retribution bringing me no closer to closure than I was before. Jason was broken. His business, his reputation, everything he had worked for had crumbled. I had done what I set out to do. I had made him suffer just as I had suffered. But now, as I walked away from the wreckage, I felt no satisfaction, no triumph. All I could feel was emptiness, a void where my rage had once burned bright. I thought about my family, about my parents, and the relationships that had been irreparably damaged. I had exposed them for their complicity in Jason's betrayal, and while part of me felt vindicated in doing so, I couldn't escape the overwhelming sadness that came with realizing how much had been lost. My parents hadn't just been bystanders, they had actively enabled the very betrayal that had torn our family apart. The guilt from what I had done to them weighed heavily on me. I had taken everything from Jason, but I had also taken away the possibility of reconciliation with my parents. I had been so consumed by the need for justice, for revenge, that I hadn't stopped to consider the consequences for everyone else involved. It was a painful realization. The people who had been closest to me were now strangers, and there was no undoing the damage I had caused. But perhaps the hardest thing to face was the feeling of loneliness that crept in. Revenge had made me feel powerful for a time, but now it left me hollow, without purpose. The people I thought I could trust, the family I thought would always be there, had been destroyed. And I too had destroyed it. I spent the following weeks alone, trying to piece together the shattered remnants of my life. I sought therapy, something I never thought I would do. I needed to understand why I had allowed myself to be consumed by such hatred and why I thought revenge would be the answer. The therapist asked me something that stuck with me long after the session ended. What is it that you are really searching for? At first, I didn't know how to answer. I had been searching for justice, for retribution, for the satisfaction of seeing Jason face the consequences of his actions. But as I thought about it more, I realized that what I had been searching for all along wasn't revenge, it was peace. True peace. The truth was, I had never really allowed myself to heal. Instead, I had buried the pain, buried the betrayal, buried everything beneath a mask of anger and revenge. I had convinced myself that destroying Jason would somehow make everything better, but it didn't. It never could. And now, I had to face the reality that healing wasn't something I could get from hurting others. It wasn't something that could be handed to me through vengeance. It was something I had to find within myself. The road to healing wasn't going to be easy. The damage I had done to my family, to Jason, to myself, it was all irreversible. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way forward. I wasn't sure what it would look like yet, but I knew that I couldn't keep living in the shadow of my past mistakes. I started small. I began reaching out to the few people who hadn't turned away from me, people who had supported me even when I had pushed them away. I made an effort to reconnect, to rebuild the relationships I had once taken for granted. It was slow, but it was a start. And as I walked down the long road to healing, I realized something important. The greatest revenge wasn't in destroying Jason or anyone else. It was in rebuilding my life, piece by piece, and reclaiming the piece that had been stolen from me. The damage had been done. There was no going back, but I could choose to move forward. I could choose to let go of the past, to let go of the anger, and to start living again. The battle for my future wasn't over, but I finally felt ready to fight it. And this time, the fight was for me. The weeks that followed were filled with uncertainty, but they also gave me time to reflect, time to figure out what came next. I spent most of my days quietly contemplating the events that had unfolded, trying to find meaning in the wreckage. The aftermath of revenge was never what I thought it would be. I had assumed that once I had Jason on his knees, once he was completely broken, I would feel a rush of satisfaction. But the truth was, I felt more lost than ever. The pain didn't go away just because I had exacted my revenge. If anything, it felt like it had been amplified, as if the more I had tried to make Jason pay, the more I had hurt myself in the process. The guilt I had been carrying around for so long was becoming overwhelming. Guilt for what I had done to my family, for pushing them away, for letting myself become someone I didn't recognize. I had become so fixated on revenge that I had lost sight of who I was, of the life I had before all of this. And it was that realization, the truth about who I had become, that hit me hardest. I wasn't a vengeful person by nature. I had never been. I had always been someone who valued family, trust, love. I had spent years trusting Jason, believing that we were family, that nothing could ever tear us apart. But somewhere along the way, I had forgotten what really mattered. In my desperation to right the wrongs he had done, I had abandoned the very principles that had once defined me. I remembered a time, before the betrayal, when things had been simple. When Jason and I had laughed together, shared secrets, trusted each other completely. When my parents had been the steady, loving presence in our lives. I realized now that I had allowed all of that to slip away, all in the name of revenge. But as much as I wanted to go back to that time, I knew I couldn't. The past was gone. Jason and I could never be the same. My family would never be the same. And that hurt more than anything else. In the quiet moments, I found myself questioning what truly mattered to me now. What was left for me after everything I had done, after everything I had lost? Was there a way to rebuild my life, to find peace amidst the wreckage? I knew I couldn't change the past. I couldn't undo the hurt, the betrayal, or the damage I had caused. But I could choose how I moved forward. I could decide whether to keep living in the shadows of the past, or whether to find a new path, a path where I could heal and grow. It wasn't going to be easy. The scars would always remain. But healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning to live with it, to make peace with it, and to find a way to move forward. I knew it wouldn't happen overnight. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I could rebuild my life. Not in the way I had imagined, not through revenge or by hurting others, but through forgiveness. Forgiving myself, forgiving my parents, and even forgiving Jason. Not because I excused what they had done, but because I needed to release the hold that anger had on me. I needed to free myself. The road to healing was long, and it wasn't without its challenges. But I was ready to face it. For the first time in years, I could finally see the possibility of a future not defined by revenge, not defined by hatred. A future where I could live on my own terms, rebuild relationships, and find peace within myself. The hardest part was accepting that I couldn't control everything. I couldn't control how my family felt about me, or how Jason would handle the consequences of his actions. But what I could control was my own life, my own choices, and the path I chose to take. And so, I chose to heal. I chose to move forward, not with bitterness, but with the hope that I could reclaim the life I once had. It wouldn't be easy, but it was a start. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. In the months that followed, life began to take on a new rhythm. I spent my days slowly rebuilding what had been torn apart, piece by piece. I didn't expect everything to be fixed overnight. There were still moments when the pain resurfaced, when I would find myself wondering if I had done the right thing, if I had gone too far. But I had come to understand that healing wasn't linear. It wasn't about erasing the past, it was about learning to live with it, and eventually, finding peace with what I couldn't change. I started to reach out to people I had once pushed away, my old friends, colleagues, anyone who had been a part of my life before the chaos. It wasn't easy, and there were times when I felt as though I had nothing left to offer. But every small step I took in reconnecting with those who had once mattered to me felt like a piece of my soul healing. I began to rebuild trust, both in others and in myself. The most difficult relationship to repair, however, was with my parents. After everything that had happened, the betrayal they had been a part of, it felt impossible to face them. But as the months passed, I realized that avoiding them wouldn't heal the wounds. We had to face the truth together. I invited them over for dinner one night. No agenda, no plan, just a simple meal. When they arrived, there was an awkwardness in the air, a tension that neither of us knew how to break. But as we sat down to eat, the silence began to shift. We talked, really talked, for the first time in what felt like forever. I shared with them the pain I had carried, the anger I had felt toward them for their complicity in Jason's actions. I told them how I had felt betrayed, not just by Jason, but by them as well. And as I spoke, I saw something in their eyes that I hadn't seen in a long time: regret. They apologized, not in the way I had hoped, but in a way that showed they understood the depth of their mistakes. The conversation wasn't easy, and it didn't solve everything overnight, but it was a start. I didn't expect them to be perfect, and I didn't expect forgiveness to come easily. But I did want to try. I wanted to rebuild something, even if it wasn't the same as it once had been. Jason, on the other hand, remained distant. He had lost everything: his business, his reputation, his family, and I could see the toll it had taken on him. There was a part of me that wanted to reach out, to offer him a chance at redemption, but I couldn't. I had already given him more chances than he deserved, and this time, it was his responsibility to face the consequences of his actions. He was broken, but so was I. We both had to live with the aftermath, and while I was trying to heal, I knew that he would have to find his own way forward. Despite all of this, there was a small part of me that couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if things had been different. What if Jason had never betrayed me? What if my family had stayed intact? Would I still be the same person I was before the storm? Would I still have the capacity to trust, to love, without all the bitterness and anger clouding my vision? I would never know the answers to those questions, but I had come to accept that the past could not be undone and that I had the power to shape my future, no matter how painful the journey. The hardest part of all of this was realizing that forgiveness wasn't just about others, it was about forgiving myself. I had spent so much time blaming Jason, blaming my parents, blaming the world for what had happened to me. But the truth was, I had allowed myself to be consumed by the need for revenge, and in doing so, I had hurt myself in ways that were far deeper than I could have ever imagined. The guilt, the shame, the anger, it was all a part of me now, woven into the fabric of my being. But I was learning to let go. Slowly, with each passing day, I was learning to forgive, not just them, but myself. It was a quiet, subtle process. I didn't wake up one morning feeling completely whole, but I woke up with a new perspective. I woke up knowing that I had the power to move forward, to find peace in the chaos I had once created. The scars would always be there, but they would no longer define me. I had spent so much of my life trying to control everything, trying to make things right through my own terms. But now, I knew that true peace didn't come from control. It came from acceptance. From accepting what had happened, from accepting that not everything could be fixed, and from accepting that sometimes, letting go was the only way to move forward. And so, I did. I let go of the need for revenge, the need for validation, and the need for closure. Instead, I embraced the future with open arms, ready to start again, to rebuild what had been broken. It wasn't a perfect beginning, but it was mine. It had been nearly a year since everything had fallen apart, the year I'd spent wading through the wreckage of my life, picking up the pieces of what had been destroyed. It felt as if I had lived a lifetime in that short span of time. So much had changed, and yet in a way, so much had remained the same. I was still learning to live with the consequences of my choices, still healing from the wounds I had caused, both to myself and to others. But I had also learned something invaluable over the course of that year: that the past, no matter how painful, could not hold me hostage forever. I couldn't change it, and I couldn't undo the mistakes I had made, but I could control what came next. I could choose to let go of the anger, the guilt, and the need for vengeance that had defined me for so long. Jason was still out there, but he was a shadow of the person he had once been. I heard rumors now and then about how his life had spiraled into further chaos, about how he was struggling to rebuild the pieces of the life he had once so arrogantly flaunted. Part of me felt a faint echo of the satisfaction I had once craved, but that feeling quickly faded. I no longer cared about his downfall. It wasn't worth the energy. It wasn't what I needed to heal. And as for my parents, things were slowly improving. We were in the process of rebuilding trust, one small step at a time. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. We had come together, finally, to acknowledge the damage that had been done, to talk about the past, and to figure out a way forward. There were still days when the weight of what had happened felt too heavy to bear, but we were trying. And sometimes that was enough. As for me, I had found my own path. It wasn't a path I had expected to walk, and it certainly wasn't one I had planned, but it was mine. I had learned to forgive, not just others, but myself. I had stopped chasing revenge, and instead, I started chasing peace. It was a long, difficult journey, and I knew I still had a long way to go, but I had taken the first steps towards something better. One evening, as I sat alone in my apartment, the weight of the past seemed to lift a little. The silence that had once suffocated me now felt comfortable, peaceful even. I no longer felt the need to fill it with anger or regret. I had learned to be okay with the stillness, to be okay with who I was becoming. I wasn't perfect. I didn't have all the answers, but I had finally found a sense of peace within myself. And that was more than I had ever imagined I would find after everything that had happened. The past would always be a part of me, but it no longer had control over my future. As I looked out the window that night, I realized that my story wasn't defined by what I had lost, but by what I was still capable of gaining. The pain, the betrayal, the loss, it would always be there, but it no longer consumed me. I had the power to shape my own future now, to find my own happiness, and to forgive myself for the mistakes I had made. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly free. The past had been a storm, one that had torn me apart and left me lost, but I had survived it. And now, as the storm faded into memory, I knew that I was stronger than I had ever been before. It wasn't the ending I had expected, but it was the one I needed. And with that, I closed the door on the past and stepped into the future.